This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
Maybe he got a bit bored and decided to study.
It's an affliction.
Boredom. So it will be a bit of a different talk today, so I'm really excited to hear about your most recent work. I usually have some notes with the speaker's biography, but I don't have it today, so I'll try not to make too many mistakes. So James did his undergraduate here at the University of Melbourne, so it's like coming home. Then did his PhD at La Trobe University, and then went on to Canada, Western Ontario, to do a postdoc with Mel Goodale, who you probably heard of, big giant. And then stayed in Canada and is at Waterloo.
Yep.
All correct?
That's all perfect, yeah.
Cool. So we're very lucky to have him over all the way from Canada, 24 hours on flights and airports. So thank you so much for making the time to talk to us.
No problem. Thank you. It's my pleasure. I'm really thrilled to be able to come back here and like as you said, to feel it's like a homecoming of some kind of it. Walking around the campus and reflecting on the fact that the last time I spent any time in this building was about 30 years ago, which kind of I shouldn't say because it really does date you. But I'm happy to chat to you today about some work that my students have been doing recently about boredom and in the context of the sense of agency or the need for agency, and very recent work that we've looked at in terms of interoceptive awareness and interoceptive accuracy. I'll start by talking about what I think boredom is, and I love this quote from Leo Tolstoy in Anna Karenina, where he describes ennui as the desire for desires. And I think that really crystallises for me what boredom is. When we're bored, we want to be engaging in something, we just don't know what we want, or the options that are available for us don't seem like they're appealing. So we want that desire for something, but we just don't know what it is. And the thing that we want to engage in has to be meaningful, purposeful to us. We used to start our papers about a decade or more ago with boredom is an understudied human experience, but we can't do that anymore. There's been, over the last 10 or 15 years, a real explosion of work in boredom and boredom proneness from a range of different perspectives. So from a meaning-making account, Wynand van Tilburg and other colleagues suggesting that boredom is a deficiency of meaning, whether in a situational kind of sense or in a broader life meaning kind of sense. People who are bored and boredom prone feel like they lack meaning. Well, my colleague John Eastwood and I and others have talked about boredom in a cognitive framework as a disengaged attentional state. When you're bored, you're failing to focus and sustain attention on the world around you or the task that's currently at hand. That leads into talking about it in this notion of opportunity costs. That boredom signals that whatever you're doing now runs the cost of doing better things in some other way. And more recently, people like Andreas Alpodoru, Heather Lynch, and others have talked about it in a functional sense. So boredom as a call to action, as a prompt to do something that's more meaningful and purposeful than what you're doing now. And you can cast that call to action in evolutionary terms. More recently, again, John Eastwood and his colleagues, and some of the work that I'll show you from our lab today, casting boredom in the context of agency, that when we're bored, it's being made fairly obvious to us that we're not being very agentic. We're not engaging with the world in ways that are showing to ourselves that we are in control, we are the authors of our own lives. So these are the kinds of frameworks that people are talking about boredom, and that'll hopefully set the scene for what I'll talk to you about today. To give you a little bit of a roadmap, I'll talk about some neuroimaging results from our lab and others that fit with that notion, I think, of boredom as a disengaged attentional state, as a struggle to focus your attention on the task at hand. All of that work, though, still begs the question of why. Why do we disengage? Why is it that we're struggling to focus our attention? And I want to suggest to you that what we're trying to do is to search for some kind of optimal way to deploy our cognitive and neural resources. We're looking for a Goldilocks zone, and I'll talk about how that might be true at two ends of a spectrum of engagement. And this also sort of fits within that framework of boredom as a signal of rising opportunity costs. I'll then follow on by talking about some of the more recent work that we've done with agency, both the individual sense of agency and their capacity to perceive agency external to the self. And I'll finish up by talking about some of this recent work about interoception and how that might undergird the sort of challenges that people who are boredom prone have with that sense of agency. So I should say too, stop me at any point, right? This is a small enough kind of group. If I say something that doesn't make any sense to you, or you've just got a thought that you don't want to hang on to till the end, don't hang on to it. Just interrupt and we'll get a conversation going. So what you're looking at here is work from Martin Ulrich and colleagues, and they weren't interested per se in boredom, but what might be considered one of boredom's potential opposites, the state of flow. And you may have been aware of this kind of state, you may have certainly experienced it. There are no fewer than 9 conditions for the state of flow to be satisfied, but the easiest way to sort of talk about it is flow is that state of intense engagement where the rest of the world just seems to drift away. You're impervious to distraction, time either constricts or dilates, everything feels quite positive and you're progressing towards your goal. So they were interested in that, and they kind of used boredom and what they considered overload, so that's what the B and the O stand for, and the F stands for flow. They use those as control conditions. And the way they did this, they've done various sorts of manipulations of things like Tetris, but here they had mathematical sums that people were doing. And so the sums could be either completely and utterly facile, this is so easy for everybody to do that you're going to get bored, or they could be well beyond an individual's capacity to do the mathematical sums, and so now you're going to be overloaded, apparently, or they could be titrated to your skills, and so at that point they're suspecting that you're going to get into that state of flow. On the left you can see brain activity in the left inferior frontal gyrus and the putamen. Not going to talk much about that. These are the areas that were associated with that flow state, or that purported flow state. On the right you see activity that's highest for the boredom state, but you can sort of see this U-shaped function. It's lowest for flow and highest for boredom and overload. And you see activity in the medial prefrontal cortex, which is a key part of the default mode network hub, right? And we activate this default mode network when there is nothing external in the environment for you to do. There's no task for you to be focused on. And the key here, though, is that there was a task. There was a mathematical set of sums that you had to do, and despite that, you're sort of kicking in this self-referential, internal thought-generating network of the default mode, because the task that you're externally supposed to be attending to is just so mind-numbingly dull. The activation of the amygdala there is perhaps more simply just related to the fact that boredom's a negatively valenced experience. I've met a handful of people who say that they don't mind getting bored, but when you actually poke and prod and probe them, they're not talking about being bored, they're talking about just vegging out, which is a very different thing, right? So no one likes being bored. That study, and a range of others like it, infer boredom after the fact, after the task that they do, and what we wanted to do was to actually induce boredom, was to make people be bored and see what happened in the brain when we did that. So to do that, my student Colleen Merrifield created this video of 2 guys hanging laundry, father-in-law and a brother. And that's the response that you always get when you first play this. People laugh, right? And actually, if you keep watching it for a little bit, I think the guy with the pink camisole does such a horrible job of hanging that thing that it continues to amuse people, this video. I think that that's because of expectations. I think people just think, you cannot be serious that you're going to make me watch this movie. After about 15 seconds of that amusing response, it becomes painfully clear that we are serious and you are going to have to watch this movie, and it's very successful at making people bored. It doesn't take long at all. We can get you bored within about 60 seconds. I am not a sadist, so I'm not going to make you watch that movie or, for the full 8 minutes that I made my participants watch it. We started off with a resting state scan because we're expecting to contrast our boredom mood induction with default mode activity that we expect to see in something like a resting state scan. Here people are just in the magnet for however long, 8 minutes in our case. You can get these things much shorter time durations now. And just looking at a fixation cross with nothing but their thoughts to amuse them. And you see activation in the posterior cingulate and precuneus. It's in that top image there. We've got bilateral temporal parietal junction activity in the middle images and the bottom image. You can't quite see it on the top there, but we also got medial prefrontal cortex activity. These are the classic hubs of the default mode network. So that's all well and good. What do we see when we make people bored? An almost identical set of activations. Posterior cingulate, precuneus, medial prefrontal cortex, bilateral TPJ. So the thing that's interesting here, like the Ulrich study that I just showed you, is that there really is an external stimulus that we want you to pay attention to. There's a movie of 2 guys hanging laundry. We've told you we want you to watch that movie, and yet it's so dull, it's so boring, that you disengage from that particular movie and instead activate this network that's about internal reverie and internal thought processes. Often activated when we see people mind wandering as well, which is potentially what's happening in this case. And we had to have a contrasting condition where we thought people would be engaged, so we showed them 8 minutes of a BBC Blue Planet documentary. And you see now those same areas that are activated in the boredom mood induction are downregulated when we have people being engaged. And we saw upregulation of the salience network and central executive network in this particular condition. So it's not a perfect attempt at looking at this, but to me this does fit well with that notion of boredom as a disengaged attentional state. You're watching this movie, but it's not going to capture your attention, and so instead you kick in with the default mode network.
Sorry, can I?
Yeah, please.
Was it functional connectivity? Are you looking at how much time they spend in that network, or what are you actually showing?
So it is functional connectivity. So we're just looking at correlated activity over the entire time of the scan. And so you see in that network that these areas are going up and down together in some sense, right? And whereas the anti-correlated activity that you see in things like the anti-correlated activity in the interest scan is that these areas are down-regulated when you see activity in the central executive network. So it's just functionally correlated activity.
Yeah, but I thought that usually in resonance that you can identify all the networks in a way, but I just kind of, rather than, I was just wondering whether you're looking at how much time they're spending in that network.
So we didn't do it in terms of how much time, and I think because, so you're right, you can identify all the networks when you do it in a resting state sort of scan. We hadn't bothered to tease apart each of them for what I'm showing you here. And when you then start to look at the boredom mood induction, you really only see that default mode hubs prominently sort of correlated with one another. And I think the only other networks that we saw anti-correlated were the salience networks, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. So we see downregulation of anterior insular cortex. And not much else, actually. So, yeah, not sure what to make of that. More recently, my postdoc, Ophir Jacobi, had a look at this with EEG, and so we just used a fairly standard attentional task here, a go-no-go task. Here you're supposed to respond to every stimulus unless they repeat. So when the F repeats here, you withhold a response. And we found that there were differences in the peak of two prominent event-related potentials, the P300 and the error-related negativity, as a function, that differed as a function of state boredom ratings. So we asked people how bored they were before and after the task, and the final sort of boredom ratings explained a significant amount of variance in both of these waveforms. And for visualization purposes, we've split it into the upper and lower tertile of state boredom ratings, and you can see that for the higher boredom ratings, that there is a lower peak in that P300 and the error-related negativity. Now, the P300 has long been associated with attentional functioning. So again, fits with that notion that when we're bored, we're in that disengaged attentional state. The ARN is a little bit more interesting, I think, in the sense that this is probably activated as an ongoing monitoring of performance. So perhaps in that boredom state that you're not as efficiently monitoring your behaviour on a moment-to-moment basis. But that's something that we'd need to follow up a little bit more. And we also did resting state scans in the EEG, so you can look at power spectra over, we had 2 minutes of eyes open and 2 minutes of eyes closed. This is eyes open data, because nothing really came out of the eyes closed resting states. And we saw a relationship with both alpha and theta, and I'm just showing you theta power here, that shows that there was a lower theta power, lower alpha power associated with higher rates of boredom proneness. So the more boredom prone you were, the less alpha activity that we saw in that resting state. And that's intriguing. A whole ton of speculative sort of things that you can think about with this. In general, alpha power is thought to be inversely related to underlying neural activity. So lower alpha power should reflect higher underlying neural activity. As I say, this is highly speculative, but one of the things that's most commonly associated with self-reports of boredom is restlessness and agitation. So when people are bored, they're not content with it. They're quite agitated and wanting to do something. So this might represent that kind of cognitive agitation, that they're bored sitting there with nothing to do for 2 minutes and showing that difference in alpha power. Like I say, it's highly speculative, but I think an interesting thing that we can follow up on. And the last neuroimaging part that I'll show you here is from Wang and colleagues looking at structural differences. This is not functional MRI, but structural MRI. And it's the only study that I know that's looked at boredom in neuroimaging from a point of view of the trait disposition. So that individual disposition to experience boredom more frequently and intensely. And they showed diminished grey matter in the precuneus and diminished structural connectivity between the precuneus and the posterior cingulate as a function of boredom proneness. So, yeah.
Could I ask you to speculate on two things from this slide and the last one?
Yeah.
So I'm curious why you think you can get changes in alpha power with eyes closed, and on this and the last one, because we're looking at boredom proneness on both, are you actually indexing discomfort with boredom because it's self-reported?
So I'll do the second one first.
Okay.
I think the second one's quite interesting. And you may well be right. That
Did you just call my first question uninteresting?
Yeah, I'm bored by it already. The first one just asks me to speculate, so I will, which I love doing. I'll get to that. I think you're quite right. When we're measuring these things, these are self-report scales that we want to try and understand what your subjective experience is, and that comes packaged with a whole heap of problems, right? We did some work to condense the tool that people have been using from the 80s, from a 28-item questionnaire to an 8-item one to single factor. But that doesn't, so statistically it's a bit more robust. That doesn't make it necessarily a better thing, a better measure. My colleague John Eastwood is starting to create yet another scale that's looking at boredom and including the need for agency as part of that. But yes, what we might be indexing discomfort with boredom is entirely possible. I think any attempts that you make to try and craft some sort of perfect self-report scale are going to be flawed in some way. So you'd have to go back and look at some of the individual items. And so I often have a hard time entertaining myself. It's one of these kind of things. Well, that might be about that difficulty, that Tolstoy difficulty of finding a desire for desires, right? And less so about, and I'm uncomfortable with it, right? But there are certainly items in there that are indexing the discomfort. And when we start to get into the neuroimaging aspects of it, the connections between what I see, the structural and functionally, and that kind of thing are, at the best, probably tenuous, right? There's a speculation. So I don't know whether it's the discomfort, the attention, or the search for something to engage with better. And that's a great question, something that we just need to do more work on. Speculating on why I don't see anything with eyes closed. I don't know, perhaps there was a more successful turn inwards to daydreaming or something. Like if you close your eyes, that might be a physical condition that allows you to just run through things in your head a little bit better, so you're not bored as much. I don't know. It's like, not something that we asked people about, which we probably should have. But yeah, it's interesting. So as I said at the start of this, I think that all of that neuroimaging work still begs the question of why are we in a disengaged state? Why is boredom characterised by disengagement? And I think that what we're actually ultimately searching for when we're bored is that optimal way of deploying your cognitive resources so that you can engage with the world in meaningful ways to you. Now, at one end of that spectrum, where whatever it is that you're doing is monotonous and dull and repetitive, and where you're watching two guys hang laundry, I think we all understand that end of the spectrum as being typical and typifying boredom, right? The monotony and the lack of change. But I want to convince you that at the other end of the spectrum, where information's coming at you too fast, and my colleague John Eastwood likes to say it's like trying to drink water from a fire hose, in those instances too, you're also going to struggle to get an intellectual foothold on whatever that information is, and you're also going to get bored because you're unable to extract meaning from that chaotic barrage of noisy information. So ultimately, we're searching for that Goldilocks zone, somewhere in the middle, where we are able to effectively deploy our resources. So what kind of evidence is there that this might be the case? Well, this work comes from Erin Westgate and Tim Wilson. They presented a whole range of different experiments in this paper. I'm just showing you one here, where they had people do what amounted to an air traffic control type task. So you've got a radar screen, you've got some planes going across that radar screen, and you have to make sure the planes don't crash. And of course, you can titrate the difficulty of that task. You can make it completely and utterly facile. There's one or two planes only on the screen, and they're moving slowly, and they're not going to get anywhere near each other. Or I can have it be very, very difficult. So lots of planes moving quickly, and the task becomes hard for you to do, which is precisely what they did. And what you're seeing here then is that ratings of boredom are highest at either end of that spectrum of difficulty. When something's too easy or when something is too hard, people are reporting those elevated levels of boredom. We looked at this using the children's game of rock, paper, scissors. And what we were interested in doing was trying to probe people's sense of control that they might have over the environment that they're in. So we did this by having people play, two groups of people play rock, paper, scissors against an opponent. And without telling them, one group would win 100% of the time, and here we imagine that they'll get a great sense of control, that they've totally owned their opponent. And the other group would lose 100% of the time. So in this condition, we hope that they're going to have some sense of a lack of control. And how would this then play out in terms of their ratings of state boredom? In two different experiments, and I can talk about the differences between them if people are interested, we see that much the same sort of thing that I just showed you from Westgate and Wilson's studies. That when people reported feeling a lack of control or complete control over the task, so at either end of that spectrum of perceived control, they reported being most bored. So whether it's something like task difficulty or your perception of control, and there's a range of other dimensions that I think we ought to be able to test, this indicates to me that what we're searching for is that optimal zone of engagement. And when we're outside of that zone, when we fall outside of that zone, either at the low or the high end of it, boredom is not sort of far away. And also, this sort of suggests to me that we are driven to act and engage on the world. So it comes a little bit from a paper in the late 50s by Robert White talking about affectance motivation, that we are driven to demonstrate to ourselves that we can effectively change the environment around us, right? And that it feels good to be able to do that. And that'll come back again when I talk a little bit about agency. One of the studies that is now, I think, pretty famous, I'm pretty sure most of you will have heard of it. If you haven't, you'll find it interesting. Again, from Tim Wilson's group. They did a series of experiments where they would put people in a room for 15 minutes with nothing but their thoughts. And so at the end of it, so they took away backpacks and phones, and there was nothing on the walls in the room. And at the end of that 15 minutes, you had to say, well, rate the experience. How did you find that 15 minutes? To be fair, about 1/3 of their participants said they quite liked it. And I can imagine that many of us might like a little bit of downtime where you can just have your own sort of thoughts. 1/3 were ambivalent, and 1/3 said, this was terrible and I was bored and I hated it, right? The experiment, the 9th experiment in their paper that made it famous, was where they put people in a room for 15 minutes with nothing but their thoughts, or you could self-administer an electric shock. And so people prior to their 15 minutes had all experienced the shock. They'd been given one taste of that shock. They all said that they would pay certain amounts of money never to experience it again. And then they got in the room, and sizable portions of them, not surprisingly more men than women, chose to go back on their word and self-administer these electric shocks. One guy shocked himself 196 times in 15 minutes. Now that goes well beyond curiosity, right? So what I think this sort of suggests is that we are driven to act and engage with the world. Now, not to suggest that we can't, and some of us might be better at others that enjoy that kind of downtime, but our general default setting, if you like, is to act on the world. And this casts boredom then as this signal of rising opportunity costs. What I'm doing is not satisfying that urge. What I'm doing right now is not satisfying that urge to act and engage with the world in meaningful ways, so I've got to do something else. And we tested this out with a sort of partial replication of Wilson's study, where we had two groups. We put them in a room for 15 minutes with nothing but their thoughts. One group were in a room that was pretty much the replication of Wilson. There's nothing in the room, nothing for them to do or to look at. The other group were placed in a room where we gave them affordances for action, but they were not able to engage them. So you can look, but you can't touch. There was a half-finished Lego puzzle that I stole from my son at the time. There was a half-finished jigsaw. There was a tablet with a browser open on it. There are a whole range of things in the room, and you said, you can look at them, but I want you to sit in this seat and just have your thoughts. And the idea was that by making those opportunity costs more obvious to people, that they ought to have a rise in their desire to engage and a rise in their boredom levels. And that's precisely what we found. When we asked them how much they wanted to engage, their wanting levels were quite high in that affordances room, and their boredom ratings were also higher. And I think the other thing I want to say about this is, I don't think that this is actually unique to humans at all. I was fortunate enough to review this paper that's now out in Nature from Yawada and colleagues a couple of months ago. The first iteration of this paper had boredom in the title and referred to boredom throughout. And one of the other reviewers said, you're anthropomorphizing, cut it out, stop it, right? So boredom is no longer in the title of this. But they essentially, for my money, replicated Wilson's study in mice. So they put mice in a room, and different groups of mice. One room had all of these toys and things that the animal would normally enjoy engaging with, and the other room was empty. In both rooms, they had a hole that the animal could poke their nose through, and if they did that, they'd get a puff of air. And mice don't like that. It's aversive. It's like the electric shock that Wilson gave to his participants. And yet what you see is that in the empty room, the mice are engaging more nose pokes. They're self-administering an aversive stimulus that they typically don't like, because it's better to do that than to do nothing, right? So I do really think that this kind of desire to act, this need to act on the world around us, is not a unique human thing. Here you're looking at local field potentials on the left in the agranulated insular cortex, and the insular cortex is going to come back up in a little while. And you can see a rising local field potentials just prior to the animal giving that sort of nose poke. They then did some viral injections into the agranular insular cortex, and they could stimulate that with blue light. And when they stimulated that with blue light, they got an increase in nose pokes in the empty room. So suggesting that the insular cortex might play an important part in those sort of exploratory behaviours, those behaviours that are engaged to try and deal with the fact that you might be in this bored state. And again, I will acknowledge that's massively anthropomorphising for the mice, but I still think it's an interesting thing to think about. And that sort of stuff from the Tim Wilson experiment with the electric shocks and the mice with the nose poke suggests that for some of us, that it's really hard to resist that urge to act on the world. And we showed this early on in the pandemic, we and others showed this early on in the pandemic when we looked at the relationship between boredom proneness, that trait disposition, and your capacity to follow the rules of social distancing. I don't want to present this as a means of demonising that particular group of people, but people who are highly boredom prone struggle to follow the rules of social distancing. And I think it's just because in that trait disposition towards boredom, you really struggle with the need to act. And it was just too much for them to be able to resist it in the ways that we were really asking to people to do. And underlying all of that, I think, is this need to be agentic, to demonstrate that you are the author of your own life and that you are in control of the goals that you're pursuing. Now, I don't know what's going on with the guy in this GIF. I can't, interpolate what's actually happening in his mind. But I suspect you're standing there waiting for something to happen, and it's kind of someone's maybe coming to pick him up, he's bored, and so he tips over the bin. We can all look at it and say it's inane, it's antisocial, it's destructive. But the other thing that behaviour does very effectively is it demonstrates his own agency. He decided to tip the bin over, however stupid that behaviour was, he tips it over, he's had an effect on the environment around him, he's influenced the world around him. And so, however stupid we think that behaviour is, it does that one thing really well, demonstrates agency to him. There's lots of different relationships with boredom proneness and aggression, boredom proneness and hostility, that I think achieves the same kind of thing. That we might think that the behaviours engaged are maladaptive and not something that we want to promote, but they certainly promote agency. So what do I mean by agency? In thinking about giving this talk here, I caught myself and had to say, you've been in North America too long. So I was going to say the crosswalk buttons, but of course you guys are going to say, that's right, what's a crosswalk button? The pedestrian buttons at the lights in places like New York City, and I'm guessing here in Melbourne, are actually useless. They do nothing. The lights are going to change in pre-programmed ways, and no amount of you touching that button is going to change that. The same is true from the closed door buttons in underground systems in London, and the same is true for closed door buttons in elevators. The open door button works, but closed door buttons just don't do anything. They're there to make you believe that you've had an effect on the world around you. So we still install them, even though we know that they're not useful and they don't do anything, because we know that humans feel better when they have some engagement with the world, that they believe that they've had an influence. And any of you got parents of young kids, the sort of 3 and 4 year old range, you'll know that experience where you come up to the lights and the kid just hammers away at the button, right? And you can say, Donnie, that's one's enough, right? Doesn't matter, the kid is going to keep hammering away at that button because it feels good to engage with the world in a way that you think is having an effect. So John Eastwood and his colleagues and my student Barbara Datsy in a study that we did as well have just recently shown that boredom proneness, that trait disposition to experience boredom, is negatively correlated with the sense of agency. So the people who are boredom prone tend to feel like they lack agency. And I think this it fits well with their failure to launch into action, their struggle with launching into action. We wanted to look at this though from the point of view of self-regulatory behaviours that we know have been, we've demonstrated and others have demonstrated that have long been associated with boredom proneness. So what kinds of self-regulatory facets am I talking about? Well, the first is self-control. So we've shown in large samples time and time again now that people who lack self-control tend to be more boredom prone. And what we're talking about here is that capacity to marshal your thoughts, actions, and emotions in the pursuit of goals. And there's an age effect here, so that as we age, we tend to get higher levels of self-control, and as that occurs, we tend to have lower levels of boredom proneness, and that's what you're seeing on the right there. So, you know, this is a fortunate thing for someone at my stage of life to sort of believe that as you get a little bit older, you gain that kind of self-control. Interestingly, if we take samples like this and we constrict the range from 17 to 22, we still see this age effect on self-control and boredom. So that even in that very small age range, as you get to the older end of that spectrum, you tend to have more self-control and less boredom proneness. And why is that interesting? It's a critical late-stage neural maturation phase. This is when your frontal lobes are finally coming online, right? So it makes a lot of sense. So we're interested in that aspect. We also took some work from Ari Kuglansky and colleagues where they look at what they call regulatory modes. This is just simply different ways in which people go about pursuing their goals. They talk about a locomotion mode, which is people who just get on from one action to the next fairly rapidly. So they talk about it colloquially as a just do it mode. And then the opposite of that would be an assessment mode. These are people who ruminate on all possible courses of action to make sure that they don't make mistakes. So colloquially, we might call that a do the right thing mode. And what you're looking at here is that, again, we've shown this in lots of different samples in our studies, that people who adopt a locomotion mode, people who just get on with things, tend not to be bored. But people who ruminate over what the right thing might be to do tend to be more bored. These are fairly moderate correlations in the undergraduate population. Interestingly, if you take it to M-Turk or prolific, the relations get stronger. So there's something about a university population, young people in the room might feel good about this, that you're just better at self-regulation than the rest of the population, perhaps. And then we're also interested in self-efficacy. So if agency is measuring how much you feel like you're in control of the goals that you pursue, efficacy is going to measure whether or not you believe yourself to be competent. Do you think you're going to succeed at the end of the day? Highly related with that judgment and sense of agency, but slightly different thing. And again, a fairly moderate, small to moderate negative correlation there, that people who tend to be boredom prone tend to believe that they're not very self-efficacious. So if we throw all this into a stepwise hierarchical regression, all of the factors that we've shown before in our studies, things like the regulatory mode of assessment and locomotion, self-control and self-efficacy, do account for about 30% of variance in boredom proneness. When we put agency of the sense and the need for agency in the final step, it accounts for an additional 3% of variance. And we've shown this in 2 or 3 samples now. It's not setting the world on fire, but it does suggest that there's some amount of this trait disposition to boredom that is accounted for by your need for agency or your sense that you're lacking agency. The next thing we did with agency was to try and understand, well, why might boredom-prone people struggle to have that sense of agency? And one immediate possibility was perhaps they just don't perceive it accurately. And they may not perceive agency accurately in themselves or others. The perception of agency in itself is sort of accounted for by these self-report scales that we've already used. But to look at the perception of agency external to the self, we turn to a task from the 40s from Heider and Simmel that you might remember from your Psych 101 days. This is, where do we go here? This is an animation that these researchers made with geometrical shapes moving around, that they then asked people to make agentic judgments, anthropomorphic agentic judgments afterwards. So you can see, you know, the big triangle, the little triangle having a bit of a fight. The big triangle says, nah, you're not coming in, buddy. The little circle sort of doesn't want a part of this. It's all too sort of scary. The bullying of the big triangle just continues at pace. It's not long, this video. It's only 90 seconds or so. He keeps bullying the small triangle, saying, no, you're not getting what you want. Eventually, the little triangle runs away. The circle's trying to hide inside the house to keep away from the big bully. That's not going to last for long. This starts to be a little bit menacing. The circle's running away, and the big triangle is going to close the door and intimidate the circle. Now the circle's shaking in its boots, trying to figure out a way to maybe dance around the big triangle and get out of there. Cowering in the corner. No, you're not getting past me. Eventually, makes a break for it. The little triangle in the circle, yay, we're winning, so kiss, kiss, oh, let's do a dance, fantastic, we've escaped this bully, uh-oh, here he comes again. They start a bit of a hide and seek or a bit of a chase scene, and then eventually they get out of here and the big triangle is hopping mad. So he's going to slam the door, he's going to slam the door again, then he's going to break the door and he's going to break the house. He's a very well regulated big triangle. So you can see it doesn't take much to anthropomorphize this animation of inanimate shapes. So you just show that 90-second video and you ask people to make judgments, to rate how eidetic they thought those characters were. And so if people who are prone to boredom have struggled to accurately perceive agency, we hypothesize, well, then they will have lower judgments of agency in this particular thing. And it turned out they didn't. There was no relation whatsoever between the trait of boredom proneness and the capacity to judge agency in that particular video. What we did find is that in the moment ratings, state boredom ratings were negatively related. And why that might be is hard to sort of know. It might just be related back to this notion of a disengaged attentional state. If you found the movie for that 90 seconds to be boring, perhaps you disengaged your attention and now you saw less agency in it because you weren't attending to the movie very well. And that's something that we're going to sort of follow up. So I'll finish up by talking about interoception. So these are these internal bodily states that we perceive, something like butterflies in the stomach, a racing heart rate, intense breathing, any of these sort of internal states, pain. And these sensations, according to people like Lisa Feldman-Barrett, are used in a predictive coding way to anticipate the affective consequences of action choices. Right? So not just to anticipate the perceptual outcomes of whatever action choices I might make, but how are they going to make me feel? And one of the things that might be the case for a boredom-prone individual is that if you have trouble anticipating those affective outcomes, that might be one of the impediments for launching into some sort of action that will meaningfully occupy your resources. But that wasn't really the reason necessarily. It's sort of a post facto hypothesis that we had. The reason why we really got to this is that our study, I didn't show you this piece of it, but our study and others have implicated the insular cortex in boredom in various sorts of ways. So here that white arrow is pointing to the insular cortex, and in our resting state we see neither correlated or anti-correlated activity in that brain region. So it doesn't seem like anything is really going on when people are in the resting state in the insular cortex. People cast the insular cortex in lots of different ways. It gets a ton of different roles as an exploratory network, as a salience network, range of different sorts of things. So you might not have expected necessarily to see any activity in that part of the brain when you're just in a resting state with nothing necessarily salient or behaviourally relevant for you to attend to. But we did see anti-correlated activity in the boredom scan. So when the default mode network was activated, there was down-regulation, if you like, of the anterior insular cortex when we made people bored. And of course we saw the opposite, that it was upregulated during our interest scan. And then there was this interesting study from Dalmas and Whitman in 2017 that also highlighted the role of the insular cortex, but in a slightly different way for boredom. They had three conditions, and I can describe to you what they are in more detail if people are interested, but essentially one that was going to make you bored, one that was cognitively challenging, and one that was just a preference task. What do you like or not? And at the end of each of these three conditions, they would ask their participants, how much money would you be willing to pay for a music download? The idea that if you were really bored, you'd be willing to pay more money to get out of that state of boredom. And that's precisely what they showed. So on the top left there, you see the amount of money people were willing to pay, and they'd pay more money after being bored than they would after the other two conditions. The change in boredom was associated with how much money they were willing to sort of pay. So the more bored you were, the more money you were willing to pay for a music download. That's on the top right. And on the bottom there, you're seeing that amount of money, that change in money that you were willing to pay to download music after being bored was associated with upregulation or activity in the anterior insular cortex. So in our hands, we see sort of downregulation of this part of the brain when you're induced into a bored state, and in their hands, you see upregulation of it as a function, I think, of your desire to get out of that bored state. And then the last thing I'll sort of show you from an imaging perspective comes from Goodale and colleagues looking at patients who've had various sort of traumatic brain injuries. And they separated their patients out into whether or not the insular cortex was damaged, and then how much of the insular cortex was damaged. So the middle group of patients there has less than 15% of the insula damaged, and the far right group has more than 15% or more of the insular cortex damaged. But the thing that they're correlating that with is alexithymia, a challenge or a difficulty in labelling your emotional states. And one might imagine, again, if I resort back to Feldman-Barrett's ideas about using insular sensory stimulation or sensory signals to anticipate affective outcomes, if you're struggling to make sense of those insular signals, then you might also struggle to label whatever those outcomes might be. And we know, and again this comes from John Eastwood's group, the people who are high in boredom proneness tend to also be high in alexithymia. They tend to struggle to label whatever it is that's going on with them. And so they show here that the group that's got more damage of the insular cortex is higher on this scale. The TAS scale is an alexithymia scale, the Toronto alexithymia scale. So we wanted to look at that directly with respect to boredom proneness. So we threw a whole bunch of scales that would measure interoceptive signals in a variety of different ways. And in each of our samples, we sort of also put in some of these other measures to make sure that our sample is not doing anything unusual, things like self-control, and in this instance too, we put alexithymia in here, to make sure that we're sort of seeing the same relations that we always see in our larger samples. So we do see this strong negative correlation between boredom and self-control. If you're high in boredom, you tend to be low in self-control. We replicate John's work with alexithymia, so if you're high in boredom proneness, you tend to also be higher in alexithymia. And then there were two scales that were measuring interoceptive perceptions that showed an interesting result for us in two samples. I'm only showing you the one sample here. And they were the self-awareness questionnaire. And this is a questionnaire, and I'll talk to you about some of the actual items in this questionnaire in a second. But for my mind, this questionnaire measures how much attention you're paying to interoceptive signals. How much are you focusing on these interoceptive signals? And we see a strong positive correlation between boredom proneness and that particular scale. And then the interoceptive sensory questionnaire is a questionnaire developed for use in adults with autism spectrum disorders to try and capture how confused you are by interoceptive signals. So in adults with autism spectrum disorders, you find this finding that sort of suggests that they do struggle to make sense of interoceptive signals. And here we get this strong correlation, and again, I think this is suggesting that people who are boredom prone are struggling to make sense of their interoceptive milieu. So this is just to show you, they're the same correlations, just showing you the static plot of it. In our second sample, all of the directions were the same, the magnitudes were a little bit smaller. But with an item from each of those questionnaires, and I can show you the full questionnaires later if people are interested, to highlight this distinction that I think we're making, that people who are boredom prone tended to be focusing inordinately on their interoceptive sensations, but then struggling to make sense of them. So the sensory awareness questionnaire is things like, I feel pain extremely. And the notion of all of the items on this questionnaire are very much about direct questions of how you're feeling these sensations. Whereas the interoceptive, the one that we're calling interoceptive confusion, asks things like, I have difficulty making sense of my body signals unless they're very strong. So it much more directly asks about this notion of being confused by your internal states. We wanted, of course, then, so these are, again, you've seen a lot in the talk that I've given today of individual different sort of surveys and questionnaires, and I acknowledge that these things do have challenges to them. So we turned to tasks, and the first task we turned to, and this is data that my student Chantal Trudeau gave me just a couple of days before I left for Australia. And so it's not very heartening, but such is life. So we started with a heart rate counting task. You just give people various durations, 15, 30, 45 seconds, and you say, tell me how many heartbeats you had while you're measuring their heart rate. So you have their actual heart rate, and you can determine how accurate they are. This is about half of our sample. The data's not going to change with the other half added in once you analyse it. It's going to be a no relation. The first thing to show is that most people underestimate how many heartbeats they've had in any of these kinds of durations. And then, of course, there's no real relationship between boredom proneness and accuracy. So I don't know what to make of that. It might be that task, and people certainly criticise this task quite a lot for various sort of problems that it might have. So it might not be a sensitive enough task. There's a phase adjustment task that we might engage where you measure people's heart rate, you play it back to them, but you play it back to them at either a faster or slower rate, and then they have to adjust it to match their own heart rate. Something like that may be more sensitive to accuracy than the simple counting task that we're doing here, but I'm not overly confident that that's going to be the case. So from a self-report perspective, people are suggesting that they're paying a lot of attention to their interoceptive signals, but they're not really making a lot of sense of them. Their capacity to pay attention might well be fairly accurate. They may be reasonably good at attending to these kinds of things, and yet they're still struggling with that capacity to make sense of it. So I've mentioned Lisa Feldman Barrett's affective predictive coding account, this notion that we anticipate the affective outcomes of our choices and then make use of prediction error to update our models and our expectations of the action choices we might make. In that account, she suggests that what we're using for those affective predictions are interoceptive signals. We don't, not just interoceptive signals, but we're prominently using interoceptive signals to anticipate our outcomes. So for something like boredom-prone individuals, there's any number of ways in which that affective predictive coding might go wrong. They might have prior expectations that are just inaccurate, so that their expectation of what counts as engaging, what counts as pleasurable, is unrealistically high. They might, and this harkens back to the EEG data I showed you, where I think people who are in a bored state are not monitoring their performance in an ongoing way very accurately, or without doing that, without ongoing monitoring of what's happening in your world, then you might not be able to update your mental representations and update your expectations appropriately. And they might just not be making effective use or efficient use of prediction errors. A lot of this stuff, I think, lends itself best to computational accounts or computational modelling, of which there's a couple that are out there at the moment. But there's certainly ways in which we can also try and think about perhaps modifying or disrupting interoceptive signals to try and test each of these kinds of things. And it of course could be that boredom-prone individuals suffer from problems at each of these steps, not just one of them. So that's kind of actually just giving you a very broad and hand-wavy hint at the direction that we're wanting to be going next. So I hope I've convinced you that boredom is this disengaged attentional state, and certainly some of the neuroimaging work that I've seen out there that we and others have done supports that notion, I think, that we are searching for an optimal way to deploy cognitive resources, and at the low end of engagement and at the high end where we're overstimulated or over-challenged, we'll experience boredom the most. I think this fits with a structural account of boredom as a signal of rising opportunity costs at either end of that spectrum of engagement. And that what undergirds this desire to engage effectively is a desire to be agentic, to demonstrate to yourself that you are the master of your life and that you're in control of the goals that you're going to pursue. That failure of agency, I think, might be undergirded by difficulties in processing and making sense of interoceptive signals. I want to acknowledge all of the people who actually make this stuff work. So I've done a lot of work with John Eastwood, and so he deserves a ton of credit for the sort of things that I present. But the people who deserve the most credit are my students. I've been blessed over the last 20 years to have really excellent students who do all the hard work and push the ideas around, and so I'm thankful for them. I'd be remiss if I didn't put a plug in for my book. There you go, I've done it, doesn't matter. And so I'm open for questions.
Thanks so much. That was really great. I was definitely in the flow. And I was thinking, oh, now I understand my kids a little bit.
Right.
You know, when they are bored, they get into lots of trouble.
Yeah.
While the audience kind of warms up for questions, I'll pick two of my questions. One is, so I saw in one of your first slides that IFG was popping out for flow, and then for boredom, it was sort of less activated, and of course IFG has been associated with inhibition. So I wonder whether, this is a little bit of reverse inference, but I wonder how much of being in the flow and not bored it has to do with an ability to inhibit everything else and focus on one thing at hand.
Yeah, it's a good question, and there's lots of evidence in boredom proneness, at least, that challenges of resistance to distraction are common, right? So one of the things is that there's a very strong relation between boredom proneness and ADHD. And there's some interesting studies with kids on and off ADHD medications. You take them off the ADHD medications, their symptoms of ADHD rise, and their reports of boredom rise in lockstep. Put them back on the meds and they both sort of drop. So that challenge of withstanding distraction is common to boredom. Whether or not, I know less, I pay less attention to the work that's on the flow state. There's not a lot of it. There's only not a lot of neuroimaging work, but there's a lot of other sort of psychological work. Whether or not flow requires your capacity to inhibit or not, I'm not entirely sure. Certainly it's a description that you are impervious to distraction when you're in that flow state. But whether or not that's because you're inhibiting the things that could potentially distract you, or because you're just, there's some sort of hyper-focus.
Yeah.
And the two things could be related, but they could also activate different parts of networks, right? So not really sure. I think it's an interesting thing to probe. With boredom proneness too, there's associations with impulse control, risky decision making. So there's a lot of evidence to suggest that, and there's problems with problem gambling, increased drug and alcohol use.
Right.
So there's lots of associations with boredom proneness suggest they're poor impulse control people, right? But I don't know about the other side of it, whether or not you need that inhibition to make flow work. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Really interesting. I wanted to pick up on the insula, and insula is obviously very complex, and there are lots of subdivisions, and it's been associated with cognitive and emotional and sensory processing, of which
It carries a lot of weight, right? Like it has to do a lot of things.
But with the anterior one, it's particularly less so about sensory processing and more so about emotional and cognitive. So, and to go back from the pure interoception and more into switching attention, that could be explained, could explain why you have anterior insular differences. But equally, when they are bored, they are probably sad or upset. That also plays into the emotional insula, which could also explain the result to some extent. So I just wanted to hear a little bit more about.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. So the Craig paper in 2009, how do you feel now? Sort of puts the anterior portion of the insular cortex as this sort of conscious representation of now, as opposed to the lower level perceptual characteristics of interoception. And so I think you're absolutely right to point that out. I don't think that necessarily means it is a continuum, right? So I don't think that means that it's not at all involved in the perceptual sort of characteristics of your interoceptive life. And as you say too, activated for switching between large-scale networks and this kind of thing. And maybe if you show increased activation in that when you're bored, which we didn't, but let's just speculate. Maybe if you did, that would be sort of being stuck. Because you would expect insular cortex activation, if it's about switching, to be transient, right? It would take you from a default mode network to a central executive or frontoparietal network. So it ought to be fairly transient. If you're stuck in that network and you're failing to launch, as we know boredom-prone people do, that might be another sort of explanation, like it's a failure to switch appropriately.
Task switching tasks, probing tasks.
Yeah, so I'll get
be useful here.
So we always have that kind of impetus that you've just got it to there. So like we know a lot of task switching stuff in relation